By the time Donald Trump said Iran could be taken out in one night, this was already way past a warning. Iranian officials were calling people toward bridges and power plants, and the President of the United States was openly threatening the very system civilians would run to if the war moved from pressure to collapse. Then came the line that killed any illusion of restraint. Power plant day and bridge day was not normal escalation language, and it was not clean deterrence either. It sounded like a president trying to terrify an entire state into movement by turning civilian infrastructure into a public hostage, and that is the exact reason this title hit so hard. Washington had explicitly tied the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to the destruction of Iranian bridges and power plants, which means one narrow waterway had become important enough to trigger threats against the civilian backbone of an entire country. If you're here for the layer after the headlines and after the spin, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments what this sounded like to you, raw strength, or the moment a superpower realized it still couldn't force the one thing it needed most. Trump did not lose it over nothing. He lost it over leverage. That is the story people click for, and that is the part most coverage still refuses to say cleanly. Because the real issue was never just whether Trump was angry. The real issue was why Hormuz made him sound like a man who thought threatening civilian collapse was now a usable negotiating tactic. If the United States already had total control of this war, it would not need language like that. If the pressure was already working, it would not need to turn a choke point crisis into public talk about wiping out bridges and power plants in a nation of more than 90 million people. That is your first clue. The threat was not only violent, it was diagnostic. It told you where the war was still unresolved. Around 20% of the world's oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz, and during this war, Iran had effectively turned that route into a live instrument of pressure. So when Trump started talking like this, he was not reacting to a symbolic insult. He was reacting to the fact that the global energy artery was still trapped inside a war he was trying to dominate. Now the title starts to open up. Hormuz is not just geography. Hormuz is time, price, risk, credibility, tanker traffic, insurance rates, and the fear that one more military move could spill straight into every fuel importing economy on the planet. That is why this story is so much bigger than one angry quote at a podium. A war can look controlled from the sky and still be dangerously uncontrolled at sea. The president can talk like total victory is near, while the market, the shipping lanes, and the allies are all hearing something else. And what they were hearing was simple. The choke point still mattered. It still hurt. It still had not been forced back into normal. When that happens, rhetoric changes. The language gets louder, the timelines get shorter, and the threats get uglier because the objective is still not complying on schedule. That is what you are really listening to in this story. Not just anger, frustration under pressure. This is the contradiction at the center of the entire episode. Even as Washington claimed Iran's navy had been broken, outside analysis said the Strait of Hormuz remained functionally closed. That means Iran did not need perfect control of the sea to win the only argument that mattered in that moment. It only needed to keep the strait dangerous enough that normal confidence never came back. That is the point most people miss. A choke point does not need to be hermetically sealed to become a strategic weapon. It only needs to become unstable enough that everyone starts calculating risk instead of assuming movement. And once risk starts doing the work, the weaker side gains something incredibly valuable. It gains the power to make the stronger side look unfinished. That is why Trump's words matter so much. The entire country can be taken out in one night is not just a threat against Iran. It is also an accidental confession that the war's central pressure point was still alive. If the lever had already snapped, the tone would have dropped. Instead, the tone got darker. That is not how completed control sounds. That is how unresolved leverage sounds when it reaches the Oval Office microphone. And the more you listen to it that way, the more the public performance starts to crack. This was not a clean winner, dictating terms. This was a superpower, trying to frighten a choke point back into obedience. Some tankers were still making it through the narrow waterway, but the disruption was already deep enough that Brent crude had surged 60% in March. That is what makes Hormuz so brutal as leverage. It does not need to become a locked gate forever. It only needs to stop feeling reliable long enough for prices, nerves, and political pressure to explode everywhere else. So no, this was never a simple open or closed story. That framing is too childish for what was actually happening. The strait was unstable enough to move the world, and that was enough to make the White House talk like time itself had become the enemy. Now think about what that does to the psychology of power. If you are the stronger side, you can tolerate resistance for a while. What you cannot tolerate is resistance that starts pricing itself into the global system while everyone watches. That is why the threat to bridges and power plants matters beyond morality. It tells you the administration was reaching for something harsher because the cleaner route, force, pressure, restore passage, claim control was not resolving fast enough. And once a state starts talking about civilian infrastructure that way, the war has changed shape. It is no longer just about military punishment. It is about social pressure by threatened breakdown. This is where the audience click really pays off. People did not click because Trump used foul language. They clicked because they could sense that he had touched something uncomfortably close to panic. Not panic in the weak sense, panic in the imperial sense. The kind that sounds like overwhelming confidence on the surface and mounting impatience underneath. The one-night threat did not come out of nowhere. Weeks earlier, Trump had already posted that the United States would hit and obliterate Iranian power plants if the strait was not fully reopened within 48 hours. So what looked like a sudden eruption was actually the climax of a pressure sequence that kept escalating because the desired compliance kept failing to arrive cleanly. That matters because repeated deadlines are information. Every new countdown tells you something about what the previous countdown did not achieve. Strong states love clocks when they think clocks will break the other side. But when the clock keeps moving and the threat keeps widening, the clock stops looking like strength. It starts looking like impatience wrapped in ceremony. That is exactly what happened here. First the demand, then the deadline, then the extension, then the harsher threat, then the public insistence that this time it really was final. That rhythm is the sound of coercion slipping. And when coercion slips in public, leaders often do the same thing. They get louder, nastier, and more theatrical, because theater is faster than results. That is why Power Plant Day was such a tell. It sounded like bravado, but it functioned like overcompensation. It was a way of trying to make uncertainty feel final before the world noticed it was not final at all. And in the YouTube title, that is exactly what Trump loses it should mean. Not random chaos, not cartoon rage. A moment when the pressure got so visible that the language itself started giving the game away. Tehran saw that too. Which is why the Iranian answer was not simple surrender. It was bargaining from disruption. Iran's reported counterproposal contained 10 clauses, including safe passage through Hormuz, sanctions relief, reconstruction, and a broader end to conflict in the region. That is critical, because it shows Tehran was not treating the strait as a switch to be flipped under American pressure. It was treating Hormuz as part of the price of ending the war on terms it could still live with. That is cold logic, not weakness. If you are damaged but still holding the only lever the stronger side urgently needs, you do not surrender that lever for free. You make it expensive. And from Washington's point of view, that is infuriating. Because it means all the visible military superiority in the world still does not translate automatically into political obedience. This is why the story keeps widening. It is not only about Trump and not only about Iran. It is about what happens when force superiority collides with choke point leverage. One side can destroy more. The other side can still dictate the cost of normality. That is the pressure chamber inside this title. The US could hit harder. Iran could still make the endgame hurt. And once both of those things are true at once, rhetoric becomes a weapon against time. Then the moral line gets shredded. Because if the strategic lever still holds, the temptation grows to punish the society around the lever holder until the cost becomes unbearable. And the second that temptation goes public, the entire war starts sounding different. The target list is no longer only military. The vocabulary itself starts crossing into civilian survival. That is why the pushback became so direct. The warning that no military objective justifies the wholesale destruction of a society's infrastructure was a straight rejection of the logic Trump had put into public view. Once civilian systems become bargaining tools, the threat is no longer just escalation. It begins to sound like collective punishment with a deadline attached. And this is where the script has to stay brutally honest. The issue is not whether every bridge or every power plant is purely civilian in some legal vacuum. The issue is that Trump publicly chose language designed to make civilian dependence itself pause of the pressure. That is what makes the title so psychologically violent. Everyone knows what a bridge does. Everyone knows what electricity means. You do not need a military briefing to understand what it means when those things become bargaining objects. This is also why the opening image matters so much. Civilians being called toward bridges and power plants is not a side detail. It is the emotional X-ray of the whole story. The rhetoric had already entered civilian life before any broader explanation even began, and once that happens, the war stops feeling abstract. It stops sounding like statesman-like pressure, and starts sounding like organized fear. That is why the audience should not leave this video thinking only that Trump said something outrageous. They should leave thinking they just watched the moment when the language of total power started revealing the limits of total power, because that is the deeper humiliation here. Hormuz made the stronger side talk like brute force could instantly solve a problem that brute force had not yet solved. Then, right at the edge of the threat, the off-ramp appeared. Trump pulled back from attacking bridges, power plants, and other civilian targets, tying that retreat to a 2-week ceasefire and the reopening of Hormuz. That reversal is not a side note. It is proof that the rhetoric had raced to the cliff, faster than stable control ever did. This does not weaken the title. It strengthens it, because now the outburst is not just explosive, it is revealing. If the threat was fully real, then the world came terrifyingly close to hearing civilian infrastructure destruction, treated as a legitimate path to reopening the strait. If the threat was partly bluff, then the bluff itself still tells you the administration needed annihilation-scale language to cover the fact that the choke point problem was not gone. Either way, the same conclusion remains standing after all the spin is stripped away. Hormuz exposed the gap between the ability to destroy and the ability to control what destruction produces. That is the sentence under the entire video, not beneath the headline. Beneath the war, military dominance is not the same thing as escalation control. It is not the same thing as market confidence. It is not the same thing as forcing a strategically wounded enemy to surrender its last useful lever on your timetable. And that is why this title works, when it is understood properly. Trump did not just lose his temper over Hormuz. Hormuz forced the strongest side in the war to sound like it was prepared to threaten a society in order to break a stalemate. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between swagger and exposure. So here is the answer to the central question. If Trump really had overwhelming control, he would not have needed to sound like this over a strait. He sounded this extreme because Hormuz was still proving that the force alone had not converted leverage into obedience. That is true if the threat was sincere. It is true if the threat was theater. And it is true if the truth sits somewhere in the ugly middle. In all three cases, the language reveals the same thing. The war was still controlling the speakers, more than the speakers were controlling the war. And once you see that, the whole episode changes shape. The quote stops being a headline and becomes evidence. The rage stops being a personality story and becomes a strategic story. The outburst stops looking random and starts looking inevitable. That is what the audience came for. Not just the line. The reason the line existed. The reason was Hormuz. The reason was unresolved leverage. The reason was that one narrow corridor of water had become powerful enough to make the White House sound like it was threatening social collapse, to restore movement. And that is the conclusion that should stay with you after everything else fades. Trump did not lose it because the war was under control. He lost it because Hormuz proved it wasn't. Stay here, because this channel follows the point where the public threat becomes the private confession.